Okay.
There we go. So hi, nice to meet
Hi.
you. To
Nice
start
to
off
meet
with,
you.
thank you. Would you like to say your name and where you are?
My name's Leonard Shaw. I'm in Seattle, Washington.
Okay. And the first question is, who are you? Who are you as a human being? And that can be values, passions, qualities, whatever you'd like to share.
Um, well, I'm a father with two kids. I am always looking for ways to make the world a better place, always looking for ways to make therapy more impactful. I'm 85 years old. Up until a year ago, I was playing basketball 5 days a week with 20-year-old kids at the community college. Ever since my cancer hit about a year ago, I haven't been able to, I'm just not agile enough to play competitive basketball. So I just shoot baskets when it's not raining. And that's probably the biggest loss in my life lately is no longer able to play competitive basketball.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay.
And I've
So,
been married to my current wife for about 35 years.
hmm, okay. And what would you say? I'm assuming basketball and therapy, but what would you say are some of your passions or some of your values?
Um, well, I've mentioned most of them.
Hmm.
Um, I've done a purpose exercise a few times that Arnold Patton came up with. He wrote a book called You Can Have It All. And the last time I did the purpose exercise was over 30 years ago, and it fit so well that it hasn't changed since then. My purpose is to use my love, creativity, and humor to teach, heal, and connect people in a loving, playful world where teacher and student are often interchangeable or indistinguishable.
Hmm. Wow.
And if what you're doing is in alignment with your purpose, then you tap into the energy of universal love. If it's not in alignment with your purpose, then you're using energy you get from metabolizing food and it's not an unlimited source.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay.
So I've been a therapist 55 years and never come close to burnout.
Hmm.
Um, I love my work.
Hmm. And what kind of things are your work? I mean, it sounds like these are purposeful projects, not just work, obviously. But
Well,
how does that manifest? What do you do?
well, currently mostly I do individual therapy, and then every spring I go teach in Europe. Um, and it's evolved over the years. And I may not be able to go this May because Germany may not be ready to receive me, but I go for about 3 weeks. I do a day and a half workshop with 60 or 70 people. Then I do two very small group, intense 5 day groups with 10 people. And then I do another large group of 60 or 70 people at a holistic school in Berlin for 4 days.
Wow, that's quite the tour.
And I've taught in Denmark and Poland and Canary Islands and um, Austria. I forget, I've lost track. Canada.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. So I am curious in I mean, 85 is a significant number of years. How are you experiencing that at this time of your life, this age?
Um, I just love my work. I don't work as much as I used to. I seldom see more than 10 people a week.
Hmm.
Uh, Nowadays, it's all Zoom and Skype and telephone. But I do Skype sessions with people in Europe or on the East Coast that have somehow found me. Um, and it's hard to imagine not being a therapist. I enjoy it so much.
Hmm.
And I do have, some things that I've um, discovered or processes I put together that I would like to teach as many people as possible. I want to pass that on to as many people as possible.
Mhm. Do you want to tell me what lines those go down?
Well, the most impactful one in 1977 and 78, I was studying Jerry Jampolsky's mini course and Tibetan Buddhism. And I read this statement in a book review. You're not your mind, you're not your ego, you're not your body, you're not your emotions. You're something grand and mysterious beyond all that. And when I read that, it just physically impacted me. And it was validating of everything that I'd been studying. And I put together this love and forgiveness Gestalt process where after I had this big ego death in 1978, and everything got easier after that. It was an amazing experience. I felt my character armor crumbling to my ankles. It was an amazing thing. And I started teaching in Toronto and Copenhagen and Frankfurt. And then I had this, it was almost like a religious calling. It just welled up inside me. I should be doing this in prisons. So for over 30 years, I did the same intensive in a maximum security prison that I'd been doing in Europe and Canada. And most of those guys had horrible things happen to them as children. They grew up and did horrible things to other people. And what I would have them do to heal these experiences was relive them with ing verbs like it's happening right now. And when they're done reliving them, then they address the perpetrator, starting sentences with, now that you raped me, or now that you molested me, or now that you almost killed me. And I would have them do 10, 15, 20 sentences starting that way. And sometimes when I feel like, well, there's more, they run out of things to say and I feel there's more, I would go over, I says, okay, if I pretend to be you and do the exercise, and they always say yes. I'd go over and stand behind them, put my hands on their shoulders, and I would really have this feeling of sinking deep into their universe. And I would continue the spontaneity exercise, now that you raped me or whatever, and come up with 10 or 15 more deeper, more vulnerable answers. Often they would cry, or I would cry, but there was so much pain and trauma. I would just let it pass through me. I would just kind of stay open and breathe, and it never stuck to me. I would go home on Sundays after the prison seminar. I'd go play basketball. I felt energized and had some of my best games. Then I have them relive the trauma as the perpetrator. And in the beginning, sometimes it's angry and blameful and in the dialogue part, but I have them relive the trauma as the perpetrator that's molesting them. And if they get deep enough in the perpetrator's shoes, there's this opening that happens, this release that happens. And it's just kind of a spontaneous forgiveness. And they change so much with that experience. And it affected how they experienced prison and how they experienced the mother that almost killed them. And the parents start visiting more often and start talking about, when you come home, you can stay with us. And it just seems like a miracle.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it was very validating of this process that I had developed. And if they put themselves deep enough in the perpetrator's shoes, they even have feelings like they had sadistic pleasure in what they were doing, and they felt, if anybody knew that about me, they couldn't possibly love or respect me. And they feel this deep connection, this heart connection with the person that they almost killed or that almost killed them. And they were just amazing experiences. And it just made me feel like, God, if it works with these guys, it'll work with anybody. So that had a big impact on me.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more to it than that. The superintendent retired. It got more and more difficult to go into the prison. In the beginning, I could go in, take food, stay there all day. We'd eat together and leave. But with the new superintendent, I couldn't bring in food. Me and all the outsiders. See, I wanted anybody on their visiting list to be able to attend the seminars.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted people from my private practice to be able to attend the seminars. If a client was stuck, no matter how much I worked with them, they couldn't get unstuck, I'd have them come to the prison seminar. They would get unstuck without even working on their issue. So it was, almost magical. And some of the guys were cynical. I would go up there 4 times a year, sometimes 5 or 6 times a year. And some guys wouldn't believe I was real until they went for 6 months to my seminars. And then they finally realized that I was authentic.
Hmm.
One guy would never sit in the circle. He would always sit outside the circle with his girlfriend. And I thought the only reason he came was for the food and to be able to sit alongside his girlfriend. Because in the visiting room, you can never sit alongside the people visiting you.
Mm-hmm.
You always have to sit at 90 or 180-degree angles. And I thought he was just coming to hang out with his girlfriend. He would never participate in exercises or processes. And I just thought he was just kind of using the system. This is this is really hard for me to talk about.
I appreciate it.
He spoke up one day and he said, I was about to throw somebody off the tier the other day. If you want to kill somebody in prison, you throw them off the tier because it's 30 feet to cement.
Right.
And the guy had arms, even though he was small, short, his arms were as big as my thighs. He was a weightlifter. So it'd be easy for him to throw anybody off the tier. But he said, I was about to throw somebody off the tier. And I thought of you people and I couldn't do it. And I just burst into tears when he said that. It just kind of amazed me. So it touched different people at different levels. Most of those guys don't get out of prison. They're in for such a long time. But I think maybe 10 of them have gotten out of prison. 2 or 3 of them got back into drugs and went back into prison or died. But the others just are living peaceful existences as good citizens, you know?
Mm.
One guy who went to all of my groups, when he got out, he got a job in a halfway house, a residential treatment center for addictions. And within a few weeks, they put him in charge on weekends because he was so grounded in this wisdom of love and forgiveness that they just felt he really knows what he's doing.
Hmm. And that's a depth of work that not a lot of therapists get into.
Well, I've been criticized for it. I mean, one therapist in Germany wrote in some kind of a Gestalt newsletter or something, highly critical of what I was doing. It's dangerous. It's not fair to the victim to have them put their shoes in the perpetrate themselves in the perpetrator's shoes, and he had all these criticisms, but I answered them all, and they published that, and I never heard any more about it.
But I mean, it sounds like you're aware of the depth of the trauma, and going
Mm-hmm.
into it may be the way through it, right? I mean, I understand being trauma sensitive and not re-traumatizing, but being in a maximum security prison is pretty re-traumatizing every day.
Yeah.
If those dynamics are just being played out amongst each other.
I tried to teach the guys, if you want out of this prison, the best thing you could possibly do is learn to love it exactly the way it is right now. And they thought I was full of shit, you know. But a couple of them really achieved that kind of inner peace, and they were released, you know. So, um, so that's the kind of spiritually based Gestalt healing process that I try to teach as many therapists as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And they, you know, you relive it first as yourself, and then start sentences with, now that you raped me. You relive it as the perpetrator, and then start sentences with, now that I raped you. Then you create a dialogue. And like I said, sometimes the dialogue is angry and hostile and blameful in the beginning, but eventually, if they stay with it long enough, and once in a while I have to feed them a sentence, it turns into a heart connection. And that's when the significant healing takes place. Now, the guys in prison were a lot more willing to relive childhood trauma and relive their crimes. But I tried to get as many of them as possible to relive their crimes first as themselves, then as the person that they, whatever, murdered, raped, molested, mugged. And an interesting thing would happen. They'd be reliving it as the victim, reliving it as their victim. And they would reach this place in the dialogue where they seemed a little stunned. And I'd say, what just happened? What occurred to you just now? And what occurred to them is, as the victim, they felt like saying, I forgive you. But as the perpetrator, they feel, I don't deserve forgiveness. I did such a horrible thing. So I found that really interesting, that when they would naturally evolve to forgiveness as the victim, I would have to say, well, go ahead and say it. I'd have to
Yeah.
encourage them to say it because they didn't feel like they deserved it.
That's very deep shame.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just gonna have to go back and cut out some barking here if someone doesn't settle down. Um, yeah, so I'm wondering, in your own history, it seems like there was a before and after. You said your ego structures dropped. How did you
Yeah.
get to that place?
Well, there were four of us therapists. Um, John Enright was one of them. I don't know if you can't interview him because he died a few years back, but he was in the Gestalt Institute of San Francisco. And there were four of us that kind of hung out together, two younger ones, and John and I. And we were studying this spiritual teacher in Salt Spring Island in the Canadian San Juans named Sydney Banks. Well, George and Roger moved to Salt Spring Island and really immersed themselves in it. And when they were ready to do a seminar, kind of like Sid Banks would do, they invited John and I as guests to their seminar in San Francisco. So, and the way Sid would do his seminars is he'd talk about the wisdom a little bit, answer a few questions, let's take a walk in the sunshine, come back, talk about the wisdom a little bit, answer a few questions. People would share how this has changed their life and whatever. At the end of the weekend, George and Roger took John and I aside and said, we just want to let you know that everything you shared this weekend came from your ego. And as soon as George said that, this old tape from my childhood was roaring in my head. Oh shit, why is it every time I get close to somebody, they need to find things wrong with me? And I'd been struggling with this wisdom for a year and I knew something was missing. And even though the sentence in my head was really strong, somehow I managed to set it aside, look George in the eye, and say, and I felt like I was turning a crank in my stomach to make my mouth move. You're absolutely right. And when I told George he was absolutely right, that's when my character armor crumbled to my ankles. It was one of the strangest physical sensations of my life. And after that, everything was easier. My work was easier. My groups were easier. Within a year, I was teaching in Toronto, Frankfurt, Copenhagen. Everything shifted. So that was my big ego death.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that that is one of the most significant moments in your life, or is there
Yes.
an?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It
Okay.
was definitely one of the most significant moments.
And what about significant people? Who comes to mind as having had a particular impact on you?
Well, John Enright had a big impact on me because he started coming to Seattle to do what he called ARC seminars. And I started referring all my clients to his seminars and going to the seminars myself. And then when he somehow finds Sydney Banks, why I started listening to Sydney Banks. So that had a big impact. Jerry Jampolsky's mini course, 18-day mini course for healing relationships and obtaining peace of mind, had a big impact on me. And there was a psychiatrist in Atlanta named Ed Askren III. And he and I were consultants on a federal project in 6 cities. And when we met at a conference around this project, I listened informally. There was a cocktail party or something after the conference. I listened to him for about 2 minutes and said, I think you're full of shit. And it was like we became instant friends. We just hit it off really well. And that night we were sharing life experiences and in, I forget whether it was his room or my room. And all of a sudden he said, do you know about Gestalt therapy? And I said, no, what's that? And he said, pretend your father's here and tell him what you just told me. And I was crying, you know, in about 7 seconds, I was crying. And I thought, oh my God, this stuff is really something.
Powerful.
And he gave me one other Gestalt experience. I had a kind of a reoccurring fantasy that kind of tortured me. And he took me through that fantasy in a Gestalt fashion. Relive the fantasy as myself, relive the fantasy as my son, relive it as the automobile, relive it as the curb, dialogue between these different parts. That was my introduction to Gestalt. So I went back to Seattle. I'm a great extrapolator and I learn by doing. So from those two experiences, I started doing Gestalt therapy with my strongest clients. And it worked so well. After a few months, I was doing it with my moderately strong clients. And within another few months, I was doing it with all my clients. And I was reading Gestalt books. I went to groups with Fritz Perls. I went to groups with Laura Perls, Jim Simpkin. And for about 3 years, I used to describe myself as a social worker who did Gestalt therapy. And I was writing a brochure one day and I just felt like I'm a Gestalt therapist. So that was my evolution into Gestalt therapy. And then when I had this spiritual death and rebirth in 78 and integrated spiritual wisdom with the Gestalt, that's what I've been doing ever since.
Okay. And I know sometimes the questions that I have feel very small, but I still want to ask some of them because I'm curious. I mean, all of this work that you've done with these different experiences of men in the maximum security prison, I'm also wondering how you've come to understand yourself as a man or in your masculinity over the course of your life.
Well, I see myself as a really loving guy that just wants to make the world a better place. And I've had, powerful Gestalt experiences with Ed Askren and with Fritz Perls. When I come across something I think is really useful and impactful, like inner child work, there was a long period where I dialogue with my inner child and ask him anything you want from me today. And what I discovered is every time I gave my inner child what he asked for, it improved the quality of my life and gave me energy and contradicted the movie I made up as a child about how the universe works. So I found that really useful. There was a period where I did morning pages for quite a while from exercise from The Artist's Way, the book The Artist's Way. And I just enjoy getting to know myself. I had individual therapy off and on, not very much for very long. And then about 12 years ago, I started working with a body therapist. And I found it really useful. So I had about 10 years of therapy, individual therapy. And that was when I was, in my 70s. And I found it really useful. And I found my work became more efficient. Um, so, and it was mostly she would put her hands on my body and I'd report what I would feel.
Mhm.
And I've had several pretty powerful experiences. One of the most powerful was I was sitting in a chair and I felt this kind of overwhelming grimness and blackness. And I chose to just completely give myself over to it. And pretty soon I saw this um, really deformed polywog, just the ugliest thing imaginable. It was kind of triangular shaped and gelatinous with all these black dots inside of it. It was flopping around on this paisley bedspread.
Mhm.
And it just was so deformed and ugly. And I I started crying. I felt all this shame and fear. And I just continued to, I just was going to let this polywog do whatever it wanted. And this was with the therapist that I worked with for 10 years. And I just surrendered to this ugliness. And all of a sudden, it looked beautiful. And all the darkness went away and it was replaced with this bright white light that doesn't hurt your eyes. And I just felt fantastic. And I felt our deepest wounds are our most beautiful parts. I just felt that on a really deep level. So that was one of the most profound experiences for me.
Yeah, it's not that I have nothing to say. I'm impacted by what you're saying.
And it was amazing for this disfigured polywog to look absolutely beautiful. And it was kind of triangular shaped, and it was about 7 or 8 inches to a side, and it was about 2.5 or 3.5 inches thick, and full of these black dots that looked so ugly until they started looking magnificent.
Hmm. So it sounds like one of the very, very deep themes in your work is transformation, right?
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. So another question that I do have is about how you experience power and privilege in your life.
Um, the way I was raised, I didn't experience much power and privilege at all. Even though, I mean, I lived with my mom till I was 12, and then I lived with my dad and stepmother. My mom was all compassion and no backbone. My dad and stepmother were all backbone and no compassion.
Hmm.
And they would stop me on the way to bed at night. I'd sit on the stairs while they told me everything that was wrong with me. And they didn't tell it like, here's your mistakes and how you can learn from them. They told me, like, this means something's basically wrong with you. So even though we were considered upper middle class or something when with my dad and stepmother, with my mom, we were poor. I didn't know we were poor because she was amazing about that. But, you know, my dad bought a new Chrysler automobile. We had a store that sold gas. We had gas pumps in 8 cabins, and a store that sold, one of these country stores sold everything: wool shirts, Indian baskets, clothing, fresh meat, fresh fruits and vegetables. It covered everything.
The
So
general store, right?
yeah. So we were considered, I think, as kind of like upper middle class or something, but I never felt that way. I could feel the privilege of of being well cared for in some ways, but I was so devastated by their attitude towards me that I always felt like a second class citizen. I've always identified very strongly with Jews and blacks. And I think I was in my 20s before I figured out it was because of the way my dad and stepmother treated me.
Mm.
So I felt privilege, but it was so minor compared to this character assassination they were doing on me. And I knew I was learning a lot. I was learning a lot about the business and how to wait on customers and pump gas and rent cabins. So I knew it was good for me. And my grades, when I lived with my mom, as soon as I started getting homework, my grades went from A's and B's to C's and D's. As soon as I went to live with my dad and stepmother, the only time they would leave me alone is when I did homework. So my grades went, you know, back up to mostly A's and some B's. So I knew it was empowering, but I finally just had to leave and go back to Seattle. The middle of my junior year, um, the school dance band wanted me for their drummer. My dad said no. He didn't want me hanging out with musicians, even though he was a musician. And when he said no, I just said, I'm going back to Seattle. And I waited 3 weeks to make sure I didn't change my mind. So 3 weeks later, I just said, I'm going back to Seattle. So that's why I didn't feel very privileged. As a white person, I've always felt like I had an unfair advantage that education wise and just in all kinds of ways, I just had tremendous advantage over blacks. And it's not that I felt guilty about it. I just wanted to do something about it. I just wanted to support or encourage, you know, racial equality. My stepdad, when I came back to Seattle, um, my stepdad was a police officer. And when we have family get-togethers, he and his police buddies would kind of tease me about being a liberal college student, and you know, and one of them one day said, "What do you really think, Leonard?" And I looked at him and I said, "I don't think you have the faintest idea what it's like to be black in America." And they never bugged me after that. He just kind of took it in. I mean, he was a nice guy. I liked him. But, you know, most of the cops I knew were bigoted.
It's ignorance, right? Not knowing.
Yeah, it is ignorance.
Wow.
Now, I feel real lucky to, even though my stepsister and my stepmother were both kind of mean to me, when they got old and my stepsister's cancer came back, I started flying to LA and helping her out, helping her get things in order and so on. She was kind of stunned by how loving I was. Like growing up with her mom, how could I be loving? And I said, well, I think it's mostly my mother. She was a very, very kind person. And then when my stepsister died and I inherited some of her assets, then my stepmother was getting old. I started driving to Yakima once a week over the pass and looking after her and taking care of her stuff. And she left me about 40% of her assets. So I feel kind of blessed that way because as a therapist, I wasn't really able to save much money for retirement. So I feel blessed by that. And then I just happened to buy a house that was zoned for multiple housing. So when I got tired of being a homeowner after 35 years, and the house was over 100 years old, I just wanted to sell it and get out from underneath it. And that was a huge undertaking. 6-bedroom, 3 bathrooms, done a lot of work on it, remodeling it and fixing it up. Had my office in my home. So when we sold it, we decided we'd give about a fourth of the proceeds to what's called charitable gift annuities. You give money to Doctors Without Borders, they give you an income the rest of your life. And as the years go by, each year a little more of that income is taxable.
Mm-hmm.
If you outlive the annuity, then it's 100% taxable. So we gave almost $250,000 to charitable gift annuities. So we're renting a condo that is outrageously expensive, but to find a place where we could have a 70-pound lab and I could see clients in the home was pretty difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So we've managed to live here for 2 years and not cut into our assets. So we're holding our own or even growing our assets a little bit. So I do feel very blessed.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say that it is a difficult balance. I mean, the ideals of, giving and doing all of this kind of work in a not-for-profit way versus trying to live as an individual.
Yes.
It's complicated. And sometimes it's, people who do charge for their work enough to buy their own home and do their own things are kind of demonized. But it's an aspect. It's an aspect of power and of privilege. But I notice that you certainly, at least I feel balanced listening to you in the sense of how you have used this and the work that you've done in the social justice sense as well.
And I read some research by Carl Rogers that I found very validating. He studied, I don't know if you know about it, but he studied the top therapists in all different schools of therapy. So their technique and their grounding was vastly different, but they were recognized as the tops in their field. Mm-hmm. And they all had 2 things in common: unconditional positive regard for their clients and non-possessive warmth. Now, what he's talking about is love, but if he had called it love back in the 50s, they would have dismissed his research probably. But I found that very validating of my approach to therapy.
Mm-hmm. And what challenges did you run into with your way of working? I mean, aside from not being able to bring the food in, not being able to bring the people in.
Well, once in a while, people might think my work is dangerous or irresponsible. I never took it very seriously. Some of the biggest challenges, the first 2.5 years after I got my master's degree, I worked at an agency, and I found that pretty constricting. So after 2.5 years, I just said, I'm going into private practice. And I never wanted to be in a position of needing my clients' money. So I had 3 part-time jobs. I did co-therapy, group therapy with a psychologist. I taught one course at a community college, and I had a I was assistant director of a research project studying family therapy. After 3 months, I quit one job. 3 months later, I quit the other one. And a year after that, I quit the research job. So those were challenges. Once in a while, when I'm making a presentation about this spiritual wisdom, somebody gets up and attacks me. And I always feel like it's a gift that the more he attacks me, the more everybody else in the group, like this happened once I was making a demonstration with 500 people at a church in Toronto. And I felt the more he attacked me, the more everybody in the room got what I was saying. Plus, he was giving a voice to their doubts, which also forwarded their evolution with the wisdom. So I just treated it not as an attack, but I just honestly answered his attacks or his questions. I gave an alternate point of view sometimes, but I didn't want him to feel obligated to accept it. And it just works out really well. So.
Sorry. I want to ask if in all of the places you've been and in the work that you've done, you've run into a person who you would say was broken, who couldn't be reached.
Well, there was one guy at prison. He was amazing. He was really smart. He really caught on. He tried to get all the inmates to come to the seminars. He would try to get them to take the hot seat. Eventually, if they never took the hot seat, he'd take the hot seat and work. And he eventually transferred to another prison. And it's rare in our state to have any therapy in prison, but that prison happened to hire a psychologist to come in and do group therapy. And so he went to that group and he started teaching what he'd learned from me. And the psychologist was so impressed, he just kind of let him become a co-therapist. But the sad thing is, as brilliant as he was and as good a therapist as he was in for rape. He got out of prison and now he's in his 60s. And he tried to set up some woman for a rape and got arrested and went back to prison. So that's one of the saddest stories. And then sometimes I run into a client. This guy was a therapist, and he wouldn't let my work touch him. He still wanted something from me, and he, was still doing everything I suggested, but he wasn't letting it touch him. And the therapy went really well in terms of demonstrating it for the whole group. There are about 70 people there. And I used the clinical director of the school in the therapy, who has a big ego and is kind of arrogant. And I had him say to this guy, "You're arrogant, you have a big ego." And the guy totally agreed with him. I mean, this guy is pretty amazing. And everybody got it. We were all laughing and everybody got it, but the client. And after the work was over with, he was really upset. He felt we were laughing at him. Uh, he didn't have any value in it. And he left the group. And I just found out his reaction by a friend of his who came back in the group and shared what was going on. And I said, whatever you do, don't make him wrong. Don't try to talk him into coming back to group. Just listen to his complaints and let him know you hear him. And that was my coaching for everybody that ran into him, if he wanted to rant and rave and complain and so on. So that was one of the most resistant clients I ever experienced. And it was one of those situations where everybody in the room was learning a tremendous amount except him.
Mm-hmm.
But really, I don't run into much resistance at all.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I was a beginning therapist, there was just something about my being that made people feel safe. People have always felt safe with me. So I just don't run into much resistance.
Yeah. And how would you say that Gestalt therapy has affected you as a person?
Well, I use Gestalt all the time. I don't journal much anymore, but if something comes up, I'll create a Gestalt dialogue. I've done a lot of therapy on my own with Gestalt. My stepmother was kind of sadistic, but she was also a bit seductive. I've gestalted having sex with my stepmother and then had a dialogue with each other afterwards. And that was a pretty powerful therapy experience, I'll tell you. So I've used it throughout my life. It's one of the most useful therapy tools there is.
I do agree. Seems like you have pretty much every part of yourself available to people.
Yeah.
I mean, I've known you for about a whopping 50 minutes at this point, but there's an incredible depth to your availability, which is really
Yeah.
interesting.
That was another thing that Rogers said. The more open and honest you are with people, the harder it is for them not to be open and honest with you.
Mm-hmm. Very true. So I'm wondering, do you feel like you're part of a Gestalt community, or do you feel separate? Is that a major part of your life, or what does that mean?
Well, we have a little, I call it the old fogey Gestalt group. The youngest therapist is in her 60s, and the oldest, Cindy and I, are both 85. And we meet, every 8 weeks or something, every 6 weeks, and play show and tell. And once in a while, we'll therapize each other. Once in a while, we'll consult about a situation. But mostly we just love and support each other. I've got therapists in Toronto, Denmark, and Germany that I'm very close to. Some of them I've been close to for over 30 years. So we don't talk a lot. A couple of years ago, the one from Germany, I said, why don't we go to the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference together? He was fine with that. So we, I think that time it was in Anaheim. So we went to that conference together. So there's a real deep love with these people, even if we don't talk for 6 months. when my cancer showed up, some of them said, if it wasn't for COVID, I'd be there. So it's a pretty deep connection.
Mm-hmm.
I try to teach all my clients, the bigger the disaster, the bigger the benefits. And I got a lot of benefits out of the first round with cancer.
Hmm.
Driving back from the hospital after the chemo, there's a winding road that's like through the forest right here in Seattle on North Capitol Hill. And I drove through that winding forested road, and nature looked so beautiful and so vibrant. It just like, it was almost like I could see it vibrating. So that was a beautiful experience. And there was one point, I think it was about the third day into my second round of chemo, my wife was being so nice to me. I had this warm wave go through my whole body, and I realized that none of my parents, I consider having three parents because my stepmother had a huge impact on my life,
Mm-hmm.
positive and negative. None of my three parents were ever that nice to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a good feeling. It kind of helped me with my reality testing about my childhood. Because, no matter how bad it is, we tend to normalize it.
Right. It's not that I
So,
was unloved, I'm just ungrateful, right?
and then, people started cooking for us and shopping for us, and people from all over the world were sending lovely messages. Even my ex-wife that I'd married to 25 years, she sent me an email. She never acknowledged me that deeply when I lived with her.
Hmm.
But she sent this long list of about 9 decisions I made that had a huge positive impact on her life. And it just blew my mind. It was amazing. So I got a lot of benefits from what some people would call a disaster. The other thing that was kind of weird was I never felt like I had cancer. I was getting this heavy duty chemo that normally they don't give to somebody my age, but because I'm unusually healthy, my doctor decided to give it a try. And even though the weekend after the 5 days of chemo, you're totally wiped out. You can hardly get out of the chair for 2 days. And then it was just back to business as usual. I didn't have nausea. Uh, I I don't know, it just didn't feel like I had cancer in some strange.
So you were saying it really didn't feel like cancer.
Yeah. I mean, the pain was so great at one point in my hip that they had me on morphine. So for about 3 days, I was on morphine and steroids, 3 happiest days of my life. But almost the instant they started the chemo, the pain went away. The cancer must have started shrinking immediately with the chemo because the pain went away. I stopped the morphine and didn't need any more pain medication. So
Hmm.
that was nice.
Mm-hmm. That's impressive. And this might be an uncomfortable question. You don't have to answer it. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on end of life. I mean,
Well, yeah, it's possible this will kill me, and I am willing to die, but I would certainly prefer to live. And, you know, I hope I live to 100 and still I'm sharp enough to be a good therapist because I thoroughly enjoy my work.
Mhm.
And it would be nice if I could go back to competitive basketball. I don't know if my left leg will ever recover enough for that, but that would be great if I could go back to competitive basketball.
Well, I don't think I've ever met someone who's 85 who's going back to competitive sports. So that's impressive itself. So that would be nice, but either way, I'm wondering what you do think of immediately as next for yourself and what you would consider a next for Gestalt in these times that we're living in right now.
Um, well, as long as I'm homebound with COVID, the only plans I have for Gestalt are just to still use it with my clients. Um, if we get through this and I get through the cancer, I plan to go back to teaching in Europe. Uh, and it's it's possible that I'll die. This new research therapy that I'm on, he has one patient who's been on it for 18 months and no sign of cancer. So normally with double hit lymphoma, hardly anybody lives more than 5 years. So I'm hoping to certainly live beyond 5 years, but I may not. I'm not very alarmed by it. My wife is alarmed by it. Um, and it's hard for her to imagine life without me. Um, and partly it's because I manage our finances and pay most of the bills and um, keep track of when the recycle is supposed to go out and things like that. But she's still working part time from home and enjoys her work except when a problem shows up. She's a fear-based perfectionist. I teach my clients love-based perfectionism uh, is free of stress because
Mm-hmm.
mistakes are just fine-tuning. Fear-based perfectionism, mistakes are a disaster. And so when something goes wrong, when she's trying to coordinate between a jeweler and a customer, and the ring's going to be mailed here or there, if it's not going smoothly, uh, it's pretty stressful for her. But she enjoys her work. So um, life is just harder for my wife than it is me. I'm more kind of go with the flow, see what happens.
Okay. So do
And
you
I have a
have any
lot of
thoughts?
curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious about this new therapy
Mm-hmm.
for my cancer.
Sounds sort of like an experimental
Yeah.
process.
And I'm really impressed with my new doctor. The guy is amazing.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad. Hmm. Okay. Well, I would love to speak with you again, and I would love to sign up for some work with you at some point if any of us can get out of the house, honestly. Um, and I'm just wondering if there's anything that you would add to our conversation today. Any other part of yourself that you feel like I'm missing right now, or
Well, I have a very high math aptitude. You're missing that.
okay.
Uh, and I find you a very mature, grounded person. I mean, your energy is terrific. I mean, you just seem to have almost no ego at all. I mean, I'm sure occasionally your
Oh, it's
kids
been
trick.
crushed. Trust me, it's been crushed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank
But
you.
I just,
I
you know,
appreciate that.
anybody that knows you is lucky to have you in their life.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, shall we leave this here then for now?
But
Someone's
sorry,
hungry
I
and
didn't.
thirsty. Should we leave
Oh,
this here for now? Somebody's hungry and thirsty.
yeah.
Okay.
It's great talking to you.